Summary of The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Philip Marlowe, a private eye, goes to the home of the wealthy Sternwood family. As Marlowe stands in the beautiful hallway, Carmen Sternwood walks up to him and starts to flirt with him. Mr. Norris, the straight-faced butler, leads Marlowe quickly to a hot greenhouse where the old General Sternwood is sitting in his wheelchair. Sternwood talks lovingly about his lost son-in-law Rusty Reagan, but that's not why he's called Marlowe. Sternwood is being blackmailed again, this time by Arthur Geiger, who says Carmen owes him money from gaming. Instead of just paying out, the general chooses to hire Marlowe to find out what Geiger is up to. When Marlowe is done with the general's older daughter, Mrs. Reagan, has Mr. Norris bring Marlowe to her beautiful sitting room. She thinks her father paid Marlowe to find her husband, Rusty. But Marlowe doesn't tell her for sure, and he thinks Mrs. Reagan is trouble. The detective goes to the rare bookstore listed on Geiger's business card. He quickly finds out that it's a front for sexual books and that the pretty Agnes Lozelle is there to keep an eye on things. Marlowe watches Geiger's shop, and when Geiger shows up, he follows him home. There, Marlowe sees Carmen come to the house and go inside. Marlowe is watching the house from a distance when he sees a flash of light and hears a scream coming from inside. There are 3 gunshots, and then someone runs out of the back of the house. Marlowe breaks into the house through a window and finds Carmen naked and drunk but unhurt, and Geiger dead on the floor. Marlowe also finds a camera, but someone has taken the plate holder. Marlowe drives Carmen home in her own car because he can't wake her up. Marlowe goes back to Geiger's house after leaving Carmen with Mr. Norris and the maid Matilda. Geiger's body is gone. The next morning, there is no word of Geiger in the news, which means the police still don't know about the murder. Chief Investigator Bernie Oles, who was the one who put Marlowe in touch with the general, calls Marlowe to tell him that one of the Sternwood's Buicks is being pulled out of the water near Lido Pier with a body inside. Oles tells Marlowe that the dead man in the Buick is not Rusty Reagan. He does this because he thinks that Marlowe is looking for Rusty. The body is that of Owen Taylor, who was the young driver for the Sternwoods. It's not clear if someone killed him or if he killed himself. Oles drops Marlowe back in town, where the detective finds that Geiger's books are being taken out of his shop and put into a moving truck. Marlowe gets a cab to follow the truck. When the truck stops at an apartment, Marlowe knows from Joe Brody's mailbox that it is his apartment. Marlowe then takes a cab back to his office, where Mrs. Reagan is waiting. Mrs. Reagan tells the detective that Carmen is being blackmailed for the pictures of the stolen plate that were taken with Geiger's camera and could be used against him. They talk about what happened to Rusty and how Carmen's boyfriend Owen Taylor died. Marlowe drives back to Geiger's house after Mrs. Reagan leaves. There, he finds Carmen. Carmen says that Joe Brody killed Geiger when Marlowe asks her about the night before. Marlowe wonders to himself what she wants. Eddie Mars, a gangster, shows up while they are talking. He and Marlowe get to know each other. Mars says he owns Geiger's house and tells Marlowe not to put his name in any reports. When Marlowe goes back to Joe Brody's flat, Brody pulls a gun on him even though Marlowe is not armed. Marlowe asks them about their plan to steal Geiger's racket. Agnes is also there. Brody says he took the books, but he says he didn't kill anyone. Marlowe figures out that Brody has the shots from the camera he found in Geiger's house. The doorbell rings all of a sudden. When Brody opens the door to see Carmen, she points a gun at his face and tells him to take her pictures right away. After a muddled fight, Marlowe gets both guns from Brody and Carmen. Brody gives the pictures to Marlowe, and Carmen runs away while Marlowe stays to ask Brody and Agnes questions. Brody says that he followed Geiger the night before. He says he was watching the back of Geiger's house when Owen Taylor, who worked for the Sternwoods, broke in and shot Geiger. Brody then followed Taylor as he ran away, beat him up, and took the camera plate. Taylor then drove away, likely to the pier. Again, the doorbell rings. When Brody answers, the man on the other end of the queue shoots him dead right away. Marlowe goes after the murderer and catches him. It's Carol Lundgren, a boy Marlo knows from Geiger's shop. Marlo figures out quickly that this is a wrong place for a revenge killing. Marlo has Lundgren drive to Geiger's house, where he calls Oles, the top detective, to the scene of the crime. Geiger is lying on a bed in a room that is locked. Then, Oles and Marlo drive Lundgren to the home of DA Taggart Wild. Oles and Marlo tell Wild what's going on and tell Captain Cronjager how bad they think his work as a city cop has been. Cronjager goes away, and Lundgren is taken into jail. When Marlo gets back to his flat, Mars calls to make sure that Marlo left his name out of the police report. Marlo says that this was the case. The agent then calls the Sternwoods and tells Mr. Norris to tell Mrs. Reagan that the pictures have been taken care of. The next morning, Marlo reads the newspapers and sees that most of what happened in the past few days has been covered up. The Sternwoods aren't even mentioned. Marlo then goes to see Captain Al Gregory of the Missing Persons Bureau to find out more about Rusty. He says he wants to rule Rusty out of the blackmail case. It looks like Rusty ran away with Eddie Mars's wife, Mona, who is also gone. Gregory says he doesn't think Eddie is involved because he's too business-minded to do something out of jealousy. Later, a gray Plymouth sedan tries to sneak up on Marlo, but he gets away. Eddie Mars owns a club called the Cypress Club, where Marlo goes to see him that night. Mars smiles and calls the detective into his office. There, Mars offers Marlo money to keep his name out of the police report, but Marlo refuses to take it. They talk about where Rusty went. Mars is shocked and worried when Marlo asks him if he is to blame for the car following him. The agent goes into the main casino and meets Mrs. Reagan there. Marlo takes her to her house. On the way, Marlo asks her what Mars is keeping from her, but she tries to change the subject. Mrs. Reagan tells Marlo to stop and tries to get him to fall in love with her. He kisses her, but he won't let her come back to his flat. Instead, he asks her again what Marlo has on her. She is angry and wants to go home. When Marlo gets back to his own flat, Carmen is naked in his bed, waiting for him. He says he will kick her out, so she leaves in a rage. When Marlo wakes up, he sees the gray Plymouth that had been following him. He talks to the driver and invites the small man to his office. The man says his name is Harry Jones and that he is a con artist. In return for $200, he says he can tell Marlo where missing Mona Mars is. Jones says that Agnes Lozelle told him that she saw Eddie Mars's man Lash Canino following Mona as she drove in the hills above L.A. Marlo spends the rest of the day thinking about it before choosing to take up the offer. He drives to Jones's office and sneaks in. When Canino asks Jones about Agnes, he hears Canino asking Jones about her. Jones drinks whiskey that Canino gives him, and then Marlo hears Jones die. Canino goes, not knowing that Marlo is there. Marlo can smell cyanide on the body of Jones. Agnes calls the office, and Marlo sets up a time for them to meet. Half an hour later, Marlo gives Agnes the $200 and asks her where Mona is. She tells him right away. As Marlo drives to the hiding place, it rains hard. He loses control of his car and hits the curb, which causes 2 tires to burst. He's lucky that the repair shop Agnes told him about is just a short walk away. He talks his way in and finds Canino and the garage owner, Art, there. 2 guys attack Marlo from behind and knock him out. Marlo wakes up handcuffed on a couch while Mona watches. He makes her agree to help him get away. Marlo then gets his gun out of his now fixed car, which he thinks was fixed as a backup way to get away, and sees Canino driving back to the house. He gets Canino out of the house by turning on the engine of his own car. When Canino comes out with a gun to Mona's back, Marlo kills him by shooting him 4 times. The next day, Marlo thinks about what happened the night before. He called Oles, drove with Mona to D.A. Wild's house, and told them everything. Eddie and Mona said they didn't want Rusty's disappearance to bring attention to them, so the cops let it go. Back in the present, Marlo goes to see General Sternwood to talk about everything. Marlowe tells the general that Geiger was trying to find out if the general was scared about something else by putting a little weight on him to see how much he could really blackmail him for. Carmen asks Marlowe to teach her how to shoot in front of the house. They drive together to a place in the middle of nowhere. Marlowe gives her a gun and sets up targets for her to shoot at. Carmen fires at him 5 times, but the gun is full of blanks. She blacks out and her mouth starts to foam. Marlowe drives Carmen back up to the house and tells Mrs. Reagan his theory. Carmen tried to shoot him because he turned down her sexual advances, just like she probably did with Rusty, except Rusty's gun wasn't full of blanks. Marlowe tells Mrs. Reagan that she must have helped Carmen cover it up. They must have asked Eddie Mars for help, and Eddie Mars came up with a complicated story to cover it up. Mrs. Reagan tells Marlowe everything and gives him money to keep quiet because she doesn't want her father to know. Marlowe says he doesn't want the money and tells Mrs. Reagan to put Carmen in a mental hospital or he will call the cops. Marlowe goes to a pub where he will think about death, the nastiness, and Mona. About the author. He was born in Chicago in the year 1888. When he was young and his parents split up, he went back to Britain with his mother. Chandler worked as a government servant and then as a reporter. He also tried, but failed, to make a name for himself as a poet and reviewer. Chandler went back to the U.S. in 1912 and worked in blue-collar jobs there until 1917, when he joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force and went to France to fight in the First World War. After the war, he went back to the U.S. and married Cissy Pascal. He then worked his way up to a management post in an oil company, but he lost that job because he was an alcoholic and the Great Depression was starting. Chandler was out of work and poor, so he started writing fiction and got it published in magazines like Black Mask to learn the trade. Chandler was known for taking much longer than most pulp writers to finish his stories, but they were very well received by critics. He was said to have helped make the hard-boiled crime story genre what it is today. Philip Marlowe is the main character in all 7 of Chandler's full-length books, many of which were made into films. Chandler also wrote for films like Double Indemnity, The Blue Dahlia, and Strangers on a Train. In 1954, Cissy died, and Chandler was so sad that he drank more than ever before. In 1959, he died of pneumonia. Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.